Registration. Registration in GST is pen based. Once a supplier is liable to register, he has to obtain registration in each of the state or UTs in which he operates under the same pen. That means if he is doing business in Gujarat, he has to obtain registration in Gujarat. If he is doing business in Maharashtra, he has to obtain different registration in Maharashtra. So for each state और यूटी he has to obtain different registration. इसका मतलब ये होता है कि हर एक स्टेट में अलग अलग रजिस्ट्रेशन लेना पड़ता है और हर एक यूटी में अलग अलग रजिस्ट्रेशन लेना पड़ता है if he is doing business in that particular state or UT. There is no concept of centralized registration. That means पहले जो सर्विस टैक्स और एक्साइज था उसमें सेंट्रलाइज रजिस्ट्रेशन का प्रोसेस था, but in this GST there is no concept of centralized registration. You have to take different registration for different state. Supplier is required to obtain state-wise registration. For each state or UT, he has to obtain different registration. A supplier has to obtain registration in every state or UTs from where he makes a taxable supply, provided his aggregate turnover exceed a threshold limit. Thus, he is not required to obtain registration from a state or UT from where he makes a non-taxable supply. So, if his aggregate turnover does not crosses the threshold limit, then also he is not required to obtain registration. And if he is doing supply of non-taxable things, then also he is not required to obtain registration. It is not compulsory for him. But if his aggregate turnover crosses the threshold limit, or if he is making taxable supply and crosses the threshold limit, then he is compulsorily liable for registration. Normally, supplier is required to obtain single registration in a state or UT. However, where he has multiple places of business in a state or UT, he has a two option. That means अगर एक से ज्यादा उसका प्लेस ऑफ बिजनेस है एक ही स्टेट में, तो उसके पास दो ऑप्शन अवेलेबल है. नंबर वन, either to get a single registration for the said state or UT where it can declare one place as a principal place of business, that is PPOB, and other branches as a additional places of business as APOB. That means what? At one place, जैसे उसका एक से ज्यादा बिजनेस का प्लेस ही एक ही स्टेट में, जैसे गुजरात में उसका एक प्लेस ऑफ बिजनेस वडोदरा में है, दूसरा प्लेस ऑफ बिजनेस अहमदाबाद में है, तीसरा सूरत में है, तो दैट मीन्स he can declare at one place as a PPOB. That is, let us take in this example, he has declared Vadodara as a PPOB and additional branches as a APOB, that is additional place of business. Or he has another option. He can also go for a separate registration for each business place. That means he can get separate registration for each place of business in such state or UT. So he has two option. उसके पास दो ऑप्शन है, या तो वो एक ही रजिस्ट्रेशन ले ले और उसमें एक प्लेस को वो पीपीओबी डिक्लेयर करे और बाकी जो ब्रांचेस है उसको वो एपीओबी डिक्लेयर करे, या तो वो अलग अलग रजिस्ट्रेशन लेना चाहता है हर एक प्लेस ऑफ बिजनेस के लिए, तो वो भी पॉसिबल है उसके लिए. Registration under GST is not tax specific. That means tax specific नहीं है. Thus there is a single registration for all taxes, that is CGST, SGST, UTGST, IGST and GST compensation cess. For all taxes he has to obtain single registration. So there is a golden line for registration. Registration under GST is state specific, but it is not tax specific. यानी स्टेट स्पेसिफिक है बट टैक्स स्पेसिफिक नहीं है. Section 22 of CGST Act, person liable for registration. So here we will discuss some code by which you can identify whether person is liable for registration or not. So code number 1 MMTN, code number 2 AMS AUPT, and code number 3 Haj others. So if you learn these three code, then you are in a position to give the answer whether registration is required under section 22 or not. Now what is code number 1? MMTN. Here in MMTN, state with threshold limit of rupees 10 lakh for both goods and services. Say for example, if a person is doing a business of goods or he is involving in supplying of services, and if he falls in code number 1, that is MMTN, then he is liable for registration under section 22 if his aggregate turnover crosses the limit of 10 lakh. And MMTN means M means first M means Manipur, second M means Mizoram, third T means Tripura, and N Nagaland. So very simple code MMTN. So if person falls in this code, he is liable for registration if his aggregate turnover crosses the limit of 10 lakh. Code 2 AMS UPT. You have to remember this code. आपको ये कोड याद रखना है. फर्स्ट कोड MMTN, सेकेंड कोड AMS UPT, और उसका पूरा नाम, वो स्टेट पे से कौन सा नाम बनता है. A मीन्स अरुणाचल प्रदेश, M मीन्स मेघालय, S मीन्स सिक्किम, U मीन्स उत्तराखंड, P मीन्स पुडुचेरी, and T means Telangana. So if he falls under this second code, then he is liable for registration if his aggregate turnover is crossing the limit of 20 lakh for goods or services or both. That means if person is supplying goods or services, his limit in second code is 20 lakh. यानी फर्स्ट कोड में लिमिट है 10 लाख. अगर वो क्रॉस करता है तो उसके लिए रजिस्ट्रेशन के लिए वो लायबल हो जाएगा. अगर वो सेकंड कोड में फॉल होता है, तो उसके लिए लिमिट है 20 लाख. अगर वो थर्ड कोड में फॉल होता है तो उसके लिए लिमिट है 20 and 40. And third code is Haj others. H means Himachal Pradesh, A means Assam, J means Jammu and Kashmir, O means other states, all other states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Kerala, etc. State with threshold limit of 20 lakh for services and 40 lakh for goods only if they are involving in intra-state business only. So this 40 lakh limit is available only fulfilling the certain condition. Here limit is 20 lakh and 40 lakh both, but 40 lakh is available only to a supplier of goods within the state only. It is not available to service provider. It is available to a person who is supplying goods only, and if he is doing business within the state, then limit of 40 lakh is available. So here three limit is there. If person crosses this limit, then he is liable for registration under section 22. We will discuss with the help of different example in next slide. So that is why you will get clear understanding when person is liable for registration. But you have to remember this code. Code 1 MMTN, code 2 AMS UPT, and code 3 Haj others. So if you remember this code only, then you are be in a position to solve the sum. Notification number 10/19 is not applicable in the following cases, and thus the threshold limit is rupees 20 lakh. Exception to section 22. So there are certain exceptions to section 22 that we have to discuss in this slide. Number 1, person required to take compulsory registration under section 24 of the GST Act. अगर कोई person section 24 में fall होता है, that means if he falls in section 24, when section 24 is applicable, Like I am giving you one example, a person is supplying goods to another state, then it is compulsory for him to obtain registration under section 24. So here limit is not applicable of section 22. 20 lakh, 10 lakh, 40 lakh. In this case, we don't see the limit. If he falls under section 24, then it is compulsory for him to obtain a registration. So that is why it is a first exception. Second one, person who has opted for voluntary registration of such registered person who intend to continue with their registration under CGST Act. Say for example, if person wants to obtain voluntary registration, or he is already registered person and he wants to continue with their registration under CGST Act, then in this case also limit is not applicable. Say for example, if his aggregate turnover is only rupees 5 lakh and he is not crossing the limit of 20 lakh, 10 lakh or 40 lakh, then also he wants voluntary registration, then in that case limit is not applicable because he go for voluntary registration. So that is why it is known as exception of section 22. Next one, supplier of ice cream, pan masala and tobacco products. So here if person is supplying these goods, ice cream, pan masala and tobacco product, then limit of section 22 is not applicable. Here limit is 20 lakh only. 40 lakh limit is not available in this case. Person engaged in making intra-state supplies in the state of, if person is engaged in the making intra-state supply in the state of Uttarakhand, Arunachal Pradesh, Puducherry and Telangana, Meghalaya and Sikkim. And second one, Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, Tripura, limit of 10 lakhs. That means what? If person is doing intra-state supply in Uttarakhand, Arunachal Pradesh, Puducherry, Telangana, Meghalaya and Sikkim, limit is 10 lakh. But this Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, Tripura, limit is 20 lakh. If they are doing intra-state supply within this state. And here you have to remember this. Supplier making interstate supply of goods are liable to compulsory registration and are thus covered in A above. That point D is already covered in A above. If person is doing supply outside the state, then he is compulsorily liable for registration. Now let us discuss different example to understand the concept of section 22. Supplier engaged in supply of which product, his aggregate turnover, what is the threshold limit that is applicable to him, and whether he is liable for registration under section 22 or not. This question answers you have to think in your mind. First one, Mr. A of Gujarat, he is exclusively in supply of shoes. Then aggregate turnover of that person is 25 lakh. But what threshold limit is applicable because he is doing business in Gujarat? That is code 3. The applicable limit is 40 lakh because he is exclusively supplies of shoes within the state. So that is why applicable limit is 40 lakh. So now whether he is liable for registration or not, answer is no, because his aggregate turnover is less than threshold limit. Second one, exclusively in supply of pan masala. So Mr. A of Gujarat is exclusively engaged in supply of pan masala. So here in this case also aggregate turnover is 25 lakh and applicable threshold limit in this case is now not 40 lakh because now limit is reduced to 20 lakh. So now whether he is liable for registration under section 22? Yes. In this case he is liable for registration under section 22. Now third case, Mr. A of Gujarat exclusively engaged in supply of taxable services. So and aggregate turnover is 25 lakhs. In this case, applicable threshold limit is 20 lakh. So now his aggregate turnover is more than threshold limit. is liable for registration under section 22. Fourth case study, Mr. A of Gujarat is engaged in supply of both taxable goods and services. In this case, his aggregate turnover is 25 lakh. Here, applicable threshold limit to him is 20 lakh. Here also, his aggregate turnover is more than applicable threshold limit. He is liable for registration under section 22. Now Mr. B of Sikkim is exclusively in supply of toys within the state. Now in this case, aggregate turnover of Mr. B is 25 lakh and applicable threshold limit in this case is 20 lakh because Sikkim falls in code 2 AMS UPT. So in this case, his aggregate turnover is above threshold limit, so he is required for registration under section 22. Now next one, Mr. B of Sikkim exclusively engage in supply of ice cream. So ice cream falls under the exceptions. So now limit is only 20 lakh and his aggregate turnover is 25 lakh and it is greater than threshold limit. So in this case also he is liable for registration under section 22. Now Mr. B of Sikkim exclusively engage in supply of taxable services, only services. In this case his aggregate turnover is 25 lakh but applicable threshold limit is 20 lakh. In this case also his aggregate turnover is more than applicable threshold limit. So he is liable for registration. Now same case, Mr. B of Sikkim is engaged in supply of both taxable goods and services. His aggregate turnover is 25 lakh. Applicable threshold limit in this case is 20 lakh. So registration is required under section 22 or not? So answer is yes. Why? Because his aggregate turnover is more than applicable threshold limit. Now Mr. K of Manipur exclusively engaged in supply of paper. His aggregate turnover is 11 lakh but here applicable threshold limit is 10 lakh and aggregate turnover is more than threshold limit. So he is liable for registration under section 22. Now next case study, Mr. K of Manipur. Manipur falls under code number 1 where applicable threshold limit is only 10 lakh. If person crosses that limit then only he is liable for registration under section 22. If he is under that limit then he is not liable for registration under section 22. Now second case study, Mr. K of Manipur exclusively engage in supply of tobacco products. Tobacco is falls under the exception of section 22 and his aggregate turnover is 11 lakh and threshold limit applicable in this case is 20 lakh and aggregate turnover is above the threshold limit. So in this case also he is liable for registration under section 22. Next case study, for same state, Mr. K of Manipur exclusively engage in supply of taxable services. His aggregate turnover is rupees 9 lakh and here threshold limit is 10 lakh. So his aggregate turnover is less than the threshold limit, applicable threshold limit. So whether he is liable for registration under section 22? No, because his aggregate turnover is less than the threshold limit. Next one, Mr. K of Manipur is engaged in supply of both taxable goods and services and aggregate turnover in this case is 11 lakh and applicable threshold limit in this case is 10 lakh. In this case he is liable for registration. Why? Because his aggregate turnover is crossing the threshold limit. So that is why that person is liable for registration under section 22. Thanks for watching my video. Do like and subscribe my YouTube channel.